Weeks passed, and the days began to blend together in a comfortable routine. The ranch seemed to hum with a new kind of life. Jack found himself looking forward to the mornings more than he ever had before. He'd wake early, do his chores, and then find Eliza already up and working beside him. There was a sense of ease between them now, an unspoken understanding that went beyond words. The bond they had formed in such a short time felt natural, and it was clear that things were changing for both of them. Eliza, too, seemed to be finding her place. Her once hesitant steps had turned into a steady rhythm, and she moved around the ranch as though she had always belonged there. She'd learned the routines quickly: how to care for the animals, how to manage the small vegetable garden, how to keep the house in order. Jack had never asked her to do any of it. She did it out of kindness, out of a need to contribute, but also because she was finding comfort in the work. It wasn't just the physical work that was changing Eliza, though. There was something in her eyes now, a spark, a quiet strength that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Jack noticed it every time they crossed paths. It was as though she had begun to shed the weight of her past piece by piece, day by day. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsaid between them. He could feel it, this tension that had been building ever since Eliza had come to the ranch. It wasn't anything obvious. They spoke freely enough, shared jokes, and enjoyed each other's company. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken connection, something both fragile and strong at the same time. Jack didn't know what to do with it. He had never been good with feelings or emotions. But every time Eliza smiled at him or laughed at something silly he said, it stirred something deep within him. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, and the sky was streaked with the colors of the setting sun. It was the kind of peaceful evening that Jack had always treasured, a moment of quiet after the long hours of work. He leaned back in his chair, resting his boots on the porch railing, and sighed contentedly. Eliza had gone inside to prepare dinner, but Jack stayed outside, enjoying the stillness of the moment. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but there was something about the evening that felt significant. After all that had happened, after everything that had changed for both of them, he knew that something needed to be said. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Eliza stepped out onto the porch carrying a tray of food. She had a soft smile on her face, but there was something in her expression that Jack couldn't quite read. "You okay?" Jack asked, his voice low. He didn't want to pry, but he could sense that she was troubled. Eliza paused for a moment, looking out at the horizon before turning to him. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, setting the tray down on the table between them. "About everything. About why I'm here and what I've been through." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He had always known there was more to Eliza's story than she had told him, but he had never pushed her to open up. He didn't want to pressure her, but now it seemed she was ready to share something. "I don't know if I've ever really told you what happened," she continued, her voice softer now. "When I left my old life, I thought I was leaving behind all the pain. But I didn't realize just how heavy that baggage would be. I thought I could start fresh, but it wasn't that simple." Jack didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her, waiting for her to continue, allowing her the space to speak. He could tell this wasn't easy for her. "I was in a bad place," she said, her words hesitant. "My family. My parents, they passed away, and everything just seemed to fall apart after that. I didn't know where to go, what to do. I ended up agreeing to come here, thinking it would be a fresh start. But it wasn't just that easy. I've carried that hurt with me, even though I tried to bury it. I guess I didn't know how to be anyone other than the person who lost everything." Jack's heart ached for her. He could hear the pain in her words, the weight of everything she had been through. He knew loss. He had lost his mother when he was just a boy, and his father had spent the rest of his life carrying the scars of that loss. Jack had never spoken much about it, but he understood the kind of pain Eliza was describing. "You don't have to carry it all on your own," Jack said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. He wasn't sure where the words came from, but he meant them. He had spent most of his life believing that solitude was the best way to handle pain, that working through it on his own was the only way. But hearing Eliza's words made him realize that maybe he had been wrong all along. She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity he hadn't seen before. There was something vulnerable yet hopeful in her gaze. "I know," she said softly, "but I didn't know how to ask for help." I didn't know if anyone would want to help me. I didn't know if I deserved it. You do deserve it, Jack said, his voice firm, more confident than he felt. Everyone deserves a second chance. And everyone deserves someone who'll stand by them, even when things aren't perfect. Eliza swallowed, and for a moment she looked away, as though she was trying to gather her thoughts. I don't know if I can ever truly heal, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But being here with you, I feel like I might have a chance to start over. To be someone who doesn't have to hide from her past. Jack reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on hers. The simple touch sent a jolt through him, something electric and real. He had never been one to share his feelings easily, but in that moment everything seemed clear. He didn't need to say more, his gesture said everything. I'm glad you're here, Eliza, Jack said, his voice low but full of meaning. And I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever. Eliza looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. It was the first time Jack saw her truly smile. Not just a polite smile, but one filled with hope. For the first time, she looked like someone who might be able to leave the past behind and build a new future. The stars twinkled above them, the night quiet and peaceful. In that moment, Jack realized something he hadn't fully understood before. They were both searching for something. They were both looking for a place to belong, for a chance to heal. And somehow, in the midst of it all, they had found each other. As they sat together side by side, Jack knew that this was just the beginning of something new. A new chapter for both of them. There would still be challenges, still moments of doubt and fear, but they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they both had found a home in each other. The next few days passed quietly at the ranch, and Jack found himself going about his usual routines, though something had shifted. Eliza was no longer a stranger to him, and even though she wasn't speaking much, her presence was felt in the house. At first, Jack didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't used to having someone around, especially someone who wasn't a part of his everyday life. But there was a certain comfort in having her there, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Eliza wasn't a burden. In fact, she was far from it. Every day she found something to do, whether it was helping Jack with the chores around the ranch, feeding the animals, or even doing little things to make the place feel more like a home. She had a way of noticing things, of picking up on the smallest details that Jack never had time for. She dusted the shelves in the small living room, cleaned the windows, and even started tending to the small vegetable garden Jack had planted last spring. Jack noticed these things, though he didn't say much about it. He appreciated her quiet efforts, but he wasn't sure how to express it. His life had always been about work, not about words. He didn't know how to open up, how to tell her that he was grateful for everything she was doing. He just let the small acts of kindness speak for themselves. One morning, Jack woke up early, as he always did. The sky was still dark, and the air had a chill that made the world feel still. He stretched, grabbed his coat, and went outside to tend to the horses. He had been doing it alone for so long that it felt odd to have someone else around. When he finished with the horses, he walked toward the barn, only to find Eliza already there feeding the chickens. She looked up when she saw him, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was something in her gaze, something that made Jack feel like she was more than just a guest on his ranch. He couldn't quite explain it, but she had become a part of his day-to-day life in a way that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just the fact that she was there, it was the way she made everything feel more complete. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but warm. She was always polite, always reserved, but there was something genuine about the way she spoke. She wasn't like the women Jack had known in his past, who spoke with expectations or demands. Eliza simply spoke because she wanted to be kind, and Jack respected that. "Morning," Jack replied, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't have to get up so early." "I couldn't sleep," Eliza said, giving him a small smile. "I thought I'd help out." Jack felt a small knot in his stomach. He wasn't used to people helping him out, especially without him asking for it. "Well, I appreciate it," he said, his voice quieter than usual. He wasn't the best at expressing his thanks, but he meant it. The two of them worked together that morning, tending to the animals and fixing up the barn. Jack found that it was easier to work alongside Eliza than he had anticipated. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was always with a sense of purpose. She never seemed to mind the work. Whether it was mucking out stalls or hauling hay, In fact, Jack started to notice something about her, something he hadn't expected. Eliza wasn't just kind and willing to help. She was strong. Her hands, though soft, could carry heavy buckets without hesitation. Her back, though delicate in appearance, could bend and lift in ways that Jack hadn't expected from someone who had just arrived. She wasn't just a woman who had fallen into tough circumstances. She was capable, resilient, and had a quiet determination that spoke volumes about who she was beneath the surface. As the day wore on, Jack found himself working alongside her more and more. They didn't speak often, but there was an unspoken connection between them, something that came from working together and understanding the land in the same way. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, Eliza had gone from being a stranger to someone who felt like a natural part of the rhythm of his ranch. That afternoon, after a long day of work, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Jack leaned back in his chair, his legs stretched out in front of him, and for the first time in a long while he felt at ease. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of silence that only comes when two people share the same space without needing to fill it with words. "You've been here for a few days now," Jack said, breaking the silence. "How do you feel about everything?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind ruffled her hair, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I'm grateful for everything you've done. I didn't know where I was going to go when I arrived here. It feels strange, being here, but I think I'm starting to feel a little more at home." Jack nodded, but there was something in her tone that made him curious. "What do you mean by strange?" Eliza looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "It's just, everything is different. The life I had before, it's so far from this. I never imagined I'd end up in a place like this, doing this kind of work. I was someone else before I came here, and now I'm not sure who I am anymore." Jack studied her face, trying to understand what she meant. He had never asked her about her past, and part of him wasn't sure if he wanted to know. He didn't want to pry into something that was clearly painful for her, but at the same time he could see the weight she was carrying, the burden of a life she had left behind, a life that no longer seemed to fit her. "You don't have to explain," Jack said, his voice gentle, "but you're not alone here. If you ever need to talk or if you need anything, I'm here." Eliza looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a gratitude that made Jack's chest tighten. "Thank you, Jack," she said softly. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done." "You don't need to," Jack said quickly. "No one should be left alone like that. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." There was a long pause between them, and for the first time, Jack felt like he truly understood her. She wasn't just a woman who had come to him out of desperation. She was someone who was searching for a new beginning, someone who needed the space to find herself again. As the last of the sunlight faded behind the hills, Jack turned to Eliza. "You're not a burden here. You're a part of this place now. And if you decide to stay, it's your choice. Just take your time. You'll find your way." Eliza smiled, though it was small and uncertain. But Jack saw something in her eyes, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. She was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find herself again. And Jack couldn't help but feel that, despite everything that had happened, this was the beginning of something new for both of them. The days that followed were quiet, as they often were on Jack's ranch. His routine didn't change. He woke early to tend to the cattle, spent hours working the fields, and finished the day fixing fences or checking on the horses. He preferred it that way. Life on the ranch was simple and predictable, just how he liked it. But there was something about the woman from the train station, Eliza, that continued to linger in his thoughts. Every time Jack rode into town to gather supplies, he couldn't help but look toward the train station, hoping not to see her again, but also secretly hoping that he would. It was a strange feeling. He had never been one to care much about other people's problems, especially someone as distant and unfamiliar as her. And yet when he saw her face, when he saw the sadness in her eyes, it stirred something inside him. But Jack never approached her again. He kept his distance, as he always did. There were enough people in town who could help her, he reasoned. People like the townsfolk or the men who had likely already noticed her would do what they could to make her feel welcome. He had his own life to tend to, and it was better to stay out of other people's business. That was how he had always lived, Still, the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. Something in Eliza's quiet sorrow tugged at Jack's heart, though he'd never admit it to anyone, not even to himself. It wasn't until a week later that Jack found himself face to face with her once more. He had just finished his usual trip to the local store, where he'd stocked up on feed for the horses and grain for the cattle. As he was loading the wagon, he noticed her standing at the edge of the street looking uncertain. She wasn't alone this time, but the man standing next to her, an older man in worn clothes with rough hands, didn't look like he was offering much help. He appeared impatient, his eyes scanning the crowd, but not in the way someone who was trying to be friendly would. Jack's curiosity got the better of him. He didn't mean to get involved, but as he passed by, he overheard part of their conversation. "Where am I supposed to go now?" Eliza's voice was soft, almost lost in the noise of the busy street. "I don't have anywhere to stay," the older man sighed, his voice gruff. "I don't know what to tell you. You should have thought of that before. You need to find someone who'll take you in." Jack felt his stomach tighten at the man's harsh tone. There was something about the way he spoke to her that felt wrong. The man wasn't offering any comfort, any reassurance. He was simply pointing out the obvious. Eliza was alone and she didn't have anywhere to go. Jack's instinct kicked in. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't stand seeing her in this position. He wasn't about to let her be abandoned on the street with no clear plan. Without thinking it through, Jack walked over to them, his boots making a steady rhythm on the cobbled road. As he approached, both Eliza and the man turned to look at him. "Is there a problem here?" Jack asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The man gave him a hard look, but Jack didn't flinch. The older man eyed Jack warily before responding, his voice low. "She's looking for a place to stay. I don't have the time to deal with her. You should probably find her someone else." Jack's gaze shifted to Eliza, and for the first time since he had seen her, she met his eyes directly. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, but also a quiet strength. She didn't seem to want to ask for help, but there was no mistaking the need in her expression. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. He didn't usually ask personal questions, especially to strangers, but something about Eliza made him forget his usual reserve. Eliza hesitated, then nodded slowly, though Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said softly, but Jack could tell it wasn't true. She wasn't fine, not by a long shot. The older man, seeing that Jack had no intention of backing off, huffed and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Jack didn't pay him any more attention. He focused solely on Eliza, wondering what he could do to help. "I'm Jack Callahan," he said, offering her his hand, his voice gentler than it had been before. "You probably don't know me, but I run a ranch just outside of town. If you're looking for a place to stay, I might be able to help." Eliza's eyes widened slightly. She seemed to consider his offer for a long moment, and Jack could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, or if she should take him up on his offer. He could understand why she'd be wary. She didn't know him, and he was essentially a stranger to her, just like everyone else in this town. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice unsure. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone." Jack shook his head. "You wouldn't be a burden. I've got plenty of room. And you're not the first person to find themselves in a tough spot around here. It's not easy for anyone to start over, but we all have to get by somehow." There was a long pause, and Jack could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to accept help, but she knew she needed it. Finally, she nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, a soft smile forming on her lips. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't say anything more. He wasn't the type to speak much about feelings or to get too sentimental, but there was a warmth inside him that he couldn't quite explain. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he was glad he had stepped in. Without saying much else, Jack motioned for Eliza to follow him. As they walked toward the wagon, Jack couldn't help but notice the way she held herself, her back straight, her steps hesitant but steady. There was something about her that intrigued him, something more than the sad eyes and quiet sorrow he had seen earlier. As they left the busy streets of town behind and headed toward the open fields, Jack felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. He didn't know what her story was, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her alone in this strange place. As the ranch came into view on the horizon, Jack turned to Eliza. "It's not much, but it's home," he said with a small grin. She looked up at him, and for the first time there was a sense of relief in her eyes. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. A place to rest, to recover, and maybe, just maybe, to start over. Eliza nodded quietly. "It's more than I expected." Jack couldn't help but smile. "Good, let's get you settled in." Jack couldn't shake the image of the woman from the train station. Even after he finished picking up his supplies and headed back to his ranch, he couldn't get her out of his mind. He told himself it was nothing, just a fleeting thought, a brief moment that didn't mean anything. But for some reason, it stayed with him. When Jack arrived back at the ranch that evening, the sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. He dismounted his horse and walked toward the barn, but as he did, he kept thinking about the woman's face. The sadness in her eyes, the way she stood there alone on the platform. He had never seen her before, yet there was something about her that made him feel uneasy, as though her presence was important somehow. But why? Jack had never been one to pay attention to his emotions. He wasn't one to dwell on feelings or wonder about people he didn't know. But as he worked late into the evening, repairing a fence near the edge of the property, the thought of her kept creeping into his mind. He couldn't help but wonder where she had come from, why she was in town, and what had brought her to this place. The next day, Jack was back in town as he often was, taking care of business and checking in with the townsfolk. As he walked into the general store, the bell above the door jingled, and he was greeted by Old Man Johnson, who owned the shop. Johnson was a tall, thin man with a bushy white beard that made him look like a character from an old western. He had been in town for as long as Jack could remember, and knew just about everyone in the area. "Morning, Jack," Johnson said, nodding his head as Jack walked in. "How's the ranch doing?" "Same as always," Jack replied, grabbing a few bags of feed from the shelves. "Cattle are good, the horses are healthy. Just another day." "You've got a lot of work ahead of you, don't you?" Johnson asked, his voice casual but knowing. "I heard you came in to pick up supplies yesterday. Saw you at the station. Wasn't that a strange sight?" Jack paused for a moment. He hadn't expected Johnson to notice anything. "What do you mean?" "The woman," Johnson said with a wink. "She got off the train yesterday. New face around here, I reckon. Looked like she'd been through a lot." "You didn't talk to her?" Jack shifted uncomfortably. "No, just saw her, that's all." Johnson nodded, raising an eyebrow. "You sure about that? She's one of those mail-order bride types, you know. I've heard she's come all the way from Illinois. Seems like she's looking for a new life, or maybe just someone to start over with. Quite a lot of those women coming out here these days." Jack's stomach twisted. He had heard of these mail-order brides before. Women who, for one reason or another, decided to leave their old lives behind and travel across the country to marry strangers. It was a strange concept to Jack, but it wasn't uncommon. Men from the western towns often placed ads seeking women to help build a home and family, and many of the women, desperate for a fresh start, answered. It wasn't love in the traditional sense, but it was something, and for many it was better than nothing. "That so?" Jack asked, trying to sound uninterested. He felt an uncomfortable tug at his chest. "I don't know anything about it. She's just a woman who got off the train." "Well, she's certainly more than that," Johnson said with a chuckle. "She's new to this town, and I reckon she'll be looking for a place to stay. You might want to keep an eye on her. Women like that don't always find what they're looking for, and not everyone out here is kind-hearted." Jack nodded, not knowing what else to say. The idea of a stranger coming to town, looking for a fresh start, made him uneasy. He had seen enough to know that not everyone in the world had good intentions, and he wasn't sure what to make of her situation. Still, something about it lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. Later that afternoon, Jack had to return to the station to pick up some additional supplies. As he walked past the platform, he saw her again, the woman from the train. She was standing, near the edge of the station, a suitcase by her side. This time, she was not alone. There was a man with her, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a rough-looking coat and a hat that shaded his face. Jack watched from a distance as the man spoke to her. She nodded slowly, looking uncomfortable, as the man's voice seemed to grow more insistent. Jack felt a strange stir of protectiveness. He couldn't explain why, but something didn't sit right with him. The way the man was speaking to her, it wasn't kind. It wasn't the way you spoke to a woman you were trying to help. There was a sharpness in his voice, a tone that made Jack's instincts flare. Without thinking, Jack approached the two of them. As he neared, the man looked up and stopped speaking, his eyes narrowing as he sized Jack up. The woman, however, seemed relieved when she saw him. She gave him a small, tentative smile. "Is there a problem here?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. The man looked at Jack for a moment, sizing him up. "No problem," he said gruffly, then glanced back at the woman. "Just making sure she gets settled." Jack wasn't convinced. The woman's expression said otherwise. There was something off about the whole situation, and Jack could sense it. He looked at the woman, and for the first time she met his gaze directly. Her eyes were full of hesitation and uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure what was going to happen next. "If you need any help," Jack said to her, "I'll be around. I don't know you, but I'm sure we can figure something out." The woman's eyes seemed to soften. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'll do if things don't work out." Jack nodded, not sure what to say. He wanted to offer more help, but the situation was too complicated. Instead, he turned and walked away, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. That night, as Jack sat by the fire at his ranch, the image of the woman kept appearing in his thoughts. He had tried to push it out of his mind, to focus on the work that needed to be done, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. She had seemed so alone, so lost, and yet, she had somehow caught his attention in a way no one had in a long time. Was she really here just for a fresh start, or was there something more to her story? Jack didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: he couldn't just walk away from this. Jack Callahan had always been a man of his word. Born and raised on a ranch in the sweeping plains of Wyoming, he was as tough and independent as the land itself. His days began before the sun had even risen, and they ended only when the stars blanketed the sky. He wasn't one for crowds or unnecessary talk. His life revolved around cattle, horses, and the quiet solitude of the open range. Jack had seen a lot in his years, but one thing he swore he would never do was marry a woman he didn't know. He had watched his father's love story unfold, and while it started with passion and fire, it ended in tragedy. His mother had died when he was just a boy, and his father, broken-hearted, never really recovered. He spent the rest of his life working the ranch alone, a shell of the man he used to be. Jack had seen how love could tear a man apart, and he wasn't willing to let that happen to him. It wasn't that he didn't like women. Jack had grown up around the women who worked the nearby farms and ranches, and while he appreciated their beauty and strength, he never found himself interested in them for more than a passing flirtation. Deep down, he knew that love wasn't something he could afford. His life was too demanding, too filled with hard work and responsibility to make room for a wife. That's why when his friends would tease him about the idea of a mail-order bride, Jack would laugh it off. It seemed like an absurd idea to him. How could a man ever expect to find a woman he could trust through a letter? It just didn't make sense. But there was always someone who would bring it up, trying to convince him that a mail-order bride was the answer to his loneliness. The town was filled with these matchmaking services, and women from all over the country were looking for a man like Jack. Someone strong, reliable, and willing to build a life with them. Some of his friends had even gone as far as to suggest he should place an ad. "Jack, you can't keep working this ranch alone forever," his best friend, Hank, would say, leaning back in his chair at the local saloon. "A man needs a woman. You need someone to share your life with." "I don't need anyone," Jack would reply, his voice low and steady. "I've got everything I need right here." But as the years passed, the words began to feel hollow. Even Jack couldn't ignore the growing emptiness he felt when the nights grew longer. The silence in the house was overwhelming at times, and though he had his horses and cattle, there was always a part of him that longed for something more. Yet no matter how much he felt the pull of loneliness, Jack couldn't bring himself to entertain the thought of a wife, much less a stranger. His heart, he believed, was too scarred. He couldn't trust easily, not after the way life had unfolded for him. The very idea of a woman coming to live with him, someone he didn't know, someone who had never experienced the hard work and struggles that came with life on a ranch, seemed like a recipe for disaster. The thought of a woman who might not understand his lifestyle, his early mornings, the long hours, the constant battle with nature, was enough to make him push the idea away every time it came up. Jack was proud of the life he had built. It wasn't much by the world's standards, but it was his, and that was enough. The ranch was small, but it was self-sustaining. The cattle were well-fed, the horses well-trained, and the fields were always worked. Jack had created a comfortable, solitary existence, and he saw no reason to change it. But there were days, quiet days, when the wind howled through the trees and the only sound was the distant moo of cattle. When Jack's thoughts would wander, he would remember his father, sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames with a sadness that never seemed to lift. Jack had always thought his father's sadness was something he could avoid. He'd promised himself that he would never end up like that, trapped by love and loss. That promise had held him strong for years, but even now, as he worked under the wide Wyoming sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Still, Jack was steadfast. He'd never been one to make decisions based on emotions. He was practical, a man who knew that love was an illusion, something fleeting and often painful. He didn't need that in his life. What he needed was peace, stability, and the freedom to live his life on his own terms. And so he carried on, ignoring the occasional whispers of his friends, dismissing the idea of a mail-order bride as a fool's dream. But like all things in life, fate has a way of pushing you toward what you least expect. One cold, crisp morning in late autumn, Jack rode into town to pick up supplies. The wind was sharp and the sky was an unbroken gray, hinting at the storm that would come later that evening. Jack wasn't in any hurry. He enjoyed the ride into town. It was his only chance to leave the ranch and interact with other people. And though he didn't particularly care for the crowds, he found some comfort in the familiar faces of the townsfolk. As he approached the station, he noticed a group of people gathered around. There was a train in the distance, its whistle cutting through the air as it approached. Jack hadn't been paying much attention to the station, but there was something about the crowd that piqued his curiosity. Most people didn't gather unless there was something special going on. Maybe it was a new shipment of goods or a rare visitor. When the train came to a stop and the doors opened, Jack's eyes were drawn to a woman stepping down from the train. She was alone, standing at the edge of the platform, her suitcase clutched tightly in her hands. Her clothes were simple, but there was an elegance in the way she carried herself that immediately caught Jack's attention. The crowd around her seemed to part, and Jack caught a glimpse of her face. It was a face full of quiet sorrow, the kind that comes with loss and hardship. Her eyes were red as though she had been crying, and though she tried to hold her composure, there was an undeniable vulnerability in the way she stood. For a brief moment, Jack felt a strange pull in his chest. He didn't know who she was or where she was from, but there was something in the way she looked, something familiar. It was a feeling Jack couldn't explain, something deeper than curiosity, but just as quickly he dismissed it. She was just another woman from somewhere else looking for a new life, probably another one of those mail-order brides his friends had been talking about. He had no interest in her, not in the way some of the men in town might. He was here to pick up his supplies, and that was it. He wasn't here to get tangled in some stranger's life. And yet, as he walked toward the wagon to gather his things, Jack couldn't help but glance back toward her. Something told him that today his world was about to change, even if he didn't know it yet.